Hello and welcome to Deep Dive Daily. Today, we're diving into the very heart of Indian democracy. We're going to break down why India chose a parliamentary system of government, a system that by its very design puts daily accountability ahead of the stability you'd get from a fixed term. Let's get right into it.
You know, for any new democracy, this is one of the biggest questions you have to answer right out of the gate. Do you go for a president who's separate from the legislature, like in the US? Or do you want a prime minister who has to answer to that legislature every single day? That one choice right there, it really sets the tone for everything that follows.
So, here's what we've got on tap for today. First, we'll lay out the two main blueprints for a democracy. Then we'll zoom right in on how India's government actually works. After that, we'll jump back in time to understand the massive decision the founders made. And finally, we'll weigh the pros and cons of the path they ultimately chose. All right, first up, let's lay the groundwork by getting a handle on the two big models for democratic government that you see around the world.
Okay, so the single biggest difference, the one thing you really need to get, is this. It all boils down to the relationship between the executive, that's the branch that governs, and the legislature, the branch that makes the laws. In a parliamentary system, the executive is basically part of the legislature. They're fused together. But in a presidential system, totally separate. They're designed to keep each other in check.
And you know, the other names this system goes by, they actually tell you a lot about how it works. It's called cabinet government because, well, the cabinet is the real heart of the operation. It's called responsible government because that cabinet is directly responsible to Parliament. And the Westminster model, that's just a nod to where it all started, in the British Parliament at Westminster. Okay, so with that background, let's bring it home to India and see how this all plays out in practice. How does this system really work on the ground? Now, this whole setup isn't just an idea. It's written right into the Constitution. Specifically, you'll find it all in Articles 74 and 75. I mean, these two articles are the absolute bedrock of the central government, spelling out exactly how the president, the prime minister, and the ministers all work together. So, what does this actually look like in India? Well, there are a few key features. First, you've got two executives, the president, who's the formal head of state, and the prime minister, who's the real head of government. The party that gets a majority in the Lok Sabha, that's the lower house, gets to form the government. Ministers have to be members of parliament, and the whole show is led by the prime minister. And here's a big one. The PM can advise the president to dissolve the House and trigger a whole new election.
But of all those points, this one right here, this is the absolute core of the whole system. Collective responsibility. Article 75 makes this law. Basically, the government acts as one single team. If the Lok Sabha loses confidence in the government over, say, a single policy, the entire government has to resign. You can't have one minister blaming another. Nope. As the famous saying goes, they swim and sink together. It's what keeps them accountable, day in and day out. So that leads to a really fascinating question, right? Why? Why did India's founders, when they had a blank slate, deliberately go down this road instead of picking something like the American presidential model? And this right here was the massive question they were grappling with in the Constituent Assembly. Do we build a government that's super stable, locked in for a fixed term, safe from the day-to-day political battles, or do we build one that's constantly responsible to the people's representatives, one that can be kicked out at any moment if it loses their trust? It's a fundamental trade-off. And the answer, laid out perfectly by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar himself, was crystal clear. This wasn't some accident. It was a very conscious, very deliberate choice. They knew the American system probably offered more stability, but they chose the British system because it offered more responsibility. And it wasn't just about that big philosophical idea. There were some really practical reasons too. For one, familiarity. They'd already been living with the version of this system for decades under the British. They also really wanted to avoid the kind of gridlock and conflict between a president and a legislature that they worried a new democracy just couldn't handle. And finally, they felt this system was just a better fit for representing India's incredible diversity within the government itself.
Okay, so that was the decision. But what's been the result? What are the real-world pros and cons that come with putting responsibility first? Let's get into it in our final section.
So let's look at the trade-offs, kind of like a balance sheet. On the plus side, you get harmony between the different branches of government and, of course, that constant responsibility. It helps prevent a single leader from becoming a despot and allows for all sorts of voices to be represented. But on the flip side, the negatives are pretty big too. It can lead to unstable governments, a total lack of policy continuity, and the risk that a cabinet with a massive majority becomes its own kind of dictatorship. And yeah, you might end up with a government of well-meaning amateurs. Let's dig into that first downside, because it's a big one: instability. This is really the system's Achilles heel, because a government's survival depends entirely on keeping that majority in Parliament. A no-confidence vote or a key ally pulling out of a coalition can bring the whole thing crashing down. And if you look back at the late 20th century in India, you saw this happen time and again, with several governments falling long before their terms were up.
But here's the crazy thing. The exact opposite problem can be just as bad. When one party wins a monster majority, the usual checks and balances can start to feel a little weak. The cabinet can get so powerful that it just steamrolls Parliament, leading to what some critics have called a dictatorship of the cabinet. The source material points to the eras of Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi as times when these kinds of concerns were really being talked about in India.
And so, that brings us right back to where we started. The founders made a clear choice: responsibility over stability, for their time, for their reasons. But for the India of today, over 75 years later, is that still the right trade-off? It's a huge question, and one that's still very much alive and being debated across the country.
And that's our deep dive for today. Hey, if you enjoyed this breakdown and found it useful, do us a favor and hit that like button and subscribe to Deep Dive Daily for more. Thanks for joining us.